Let's start with your own mentors. Who would you consider your own mentors?
Well, of course, I have to consider Hellman. I wouldn't. Basically, all the work I did before I met Hellman, I didn't know how to publish. I didn't know how to judge what was important. I didn't know what would be. There are several issues about publication, right? And one of them, of course, is what's good for you. And lots of people, even publishing things that are not terribly important work, one, they're often useful to other people, and two, they are good for your career. So I was not very well in touch with any of that before I met Hellman. My mind kind of goes blank when you ask questions like this, but I guess I'd have to say, with the exception of Hellman, I'm not sure that any of the other people I would name thought of themselves as mentoring me. Right. So I often say Roland Silver, who was he's the reason I think I got the job at MITRE in 1965. He is an unsung uber hero of computing. He understood structured programming a decade before the people who made it famous discovered it, and he didn't know how to publish. Later in his life, he published quite a lot of stuff, but he had a lot of writer's block or something, and probably didn't understand what was critical.
He was at MITRE?
He was at MITRE at that time. He'd worked for DEC. I don't know his resume that well. He left MITRE earlier in 1969 than I did, and moved to Taos, New Mexico, and worked freelance from there. He was a tremendously organized person who could undertake a project and do a top-down design and write all the code. So he had a very nice, marketable talent.
So what was your interaction with him like?
Well, talking about random things the way I do with most people. I mean, there were moments, I remember moments, showing me how a piece of code worked and things like that. And in taking over pieces of code that he'd written and understanding exactly how well organized they were. But it just feels like a friendship or something. It doesn't, I can't identify this important working component. We had serious conversations about issues that didn't bear on what we were working on at that moment. Right? He belonged, I understand there's a German word for this, but I've forgotten it, a culture of serious conversation. And he was, what I remember talking to a German interviewer, his name slips my mind, but the interview is on the web, and saying that I found that at my corporation, I was then working for Bell Northern Research, people's conversations, they seem to think of them as just trivial conversations, or not of any consequence for the world. Whereas at MIT, people talked about things that were way away from their recognized expertise, but with a confidence that if they turned their attentions to these things, they could do something about them. That it wasn't frivolous to be discussing the great problems of the world and so forth. So I think my conversations with Roland Silver were like that. I have to name John McCarthy. I worked for John McCarthy for several years around 1970, and knew him, last saw him a week or so before he died. I think I'd have to name a man named Peter Schweitzer, also not terribly well known. One of the things he did was discovered why laser light sparkles. That sort of bubbly look. But he worked for Horst Feistel at the Air Force Cambridge Research Lab cryptographic group around in the early 50s, and I learned a great deal from him. These things, the word mentor, normally you think of a mentor as somebody who is in a senior position within an organization or something like that. I'm telling you about people whom my functional relationship was some combination of friendship and intellectual compatibility.
That seems to fit your relationship with Dr. Hellman.
Yes, except that Hellman was at least one, he taught me things within the framework of his being a professor and my being a student. Right? And so that one really does fit, right? I mean, he did things with me and with things that I did that advanced our position in the world in a more organized way than any of the others. I mean, if I think of a mentor in terms of people I learn things from, or people who influence my behavior, my interests, probably my late wife, Mary Fisher, has as great a standing as anyone else. I mean, so my whole way of living, whole way of thinking changed as a function of meeting her.
So this is your first Heidelberg Laureate Forum, right? Because
it is.
You got your Turing Award recently.
Right.
I imagine people have come up to you and have been looking for wisdom. How do you deal with that? How do you think you get that across?
People maybe come up to me and ask me explicit questions. I don't remember. I mean, I just chat with people. Now, yesterday on the boat, somebody wanted to talk about ethics, and we just plain had a conversation. I'm maybe a little less prejudiced against ethics now than I was before. I think of ethics often as a rationalization for manipulating people into doing things that aren't really in their best interest. And this guy came up with some examples of ethical issues. Oh yeah. His name is Maurice Chaudot. I'm not good with names, and he has an organization at Cambridge for mathematics and ethics or something of that kind.
And he changed your mind?
A little bit, yeah.
So, well, that's time.
I don't know whether I changed his. You can get him and ask him. He was upstairs a few minutes ago going off to talk to Vince Cerf. Yeah.
So how have you found the forum?
I've enjoyed it very much. One sense I have is, of course, I understand there are practical reasons for not making it longer, but one's just getting warmed up after about 4 or 5 days of this. Right? I was unhappy. I didn't conduct myself correctly on Monday. That is to say, I didn't either take the Heidelberg tour or go to the discussion of quantum topological computing or whatever it was called. Right. So I didn't get the best results on Monday, and in general I'm opposed. I don't like parallel sessions and breakout sessions and the format of this kind of discussion groups where they sort of produce a final report and claim to have accomplished something in an hour rather than just had a chat. But of course, all of the entertainment parts have been pretty good. And I don't know if you want this kind of nitty-gritty. I mean, that dinner we had, the first of the big dinners we had. No, that's an inaccurate description. We had a dinner in a rounded Gothic Mensa somewhere across the square from here. Yeah. That was the first one. That wasn't bad because the format promoted a lot of moving around. Sort of easy to walk off and go to the bar and get a drink and come back and go and get a bit of food and come back and so forth. And you keep ending up, the number of people at the table have shifted and so forth. So that, I thought in a couple of hours, that place was too noisy. But other than that, I found it easy to talk to a variety of people. The next one was a sit-down dinner somewhere with 8 people at assigned tables, and they had 1 laureate per table. or maybe it was at most one laureate. I think some tables lacked laureates, and people there'd been a drawing for numbers to be at tables. Well, I could not see the two people who were across the table from me because there was stuff piled up. I could barely hear anybody but the two people right next to me. So I didn't think I was able to serve their interest terribly well. I was very proud of discovering then that we could detach the balloon from its rock and weight it just right and get it to float around the room.
I was at the table next to you guys. You guys were we're having a lot of fun.
Well, that required less time. We got more fun out of less talking, and given that it was so difficult to talk in there, that was, I was happy with doing that. I thought the boat ride was very good. I got stuck. I enjoyed it, but the point is, I only talked to a changing crew of four to eight or something like that over a period of whatever it was, 2 hours or something. I had forgotten to bring a hat, so I didn't want to spend very much time up on the top deck, and I had no idea. For some reason, I don't have no idea why the students at the beginning were almost all up on the top. Maybe they were told to do that, and there were a few people in the middle deck sitting around at the tables by the windows. But students then came downstairs subsequently, and so I thought that was a good format. It was quiet. Maybe it wouldn't have been quiet if enough people had settled into the middle deck, but it was better than other places.
Yeah, I noticed that as well, that immediately, I think it was just the excitement of being, outside on a boat.
Yeah, no, I think my inclination, as soon as I got in, I sat down first with Marty and Dorothy, and then moved over to talk to John Hopcroft, and then, it's partly, before I went to talk to John Hopcroft, I thought, well, let me find the way upstairs and see what it's like outside, and then talk to him, and he said, I've forgotten, he had some excuse for why he couldn't go upstairs, sun sensitive or something of that kind, but he said, you should go upstairs and talk to students, and I thought, that's a responsible thing to do, so I'll go do that. And then the Bavarian night was in between. That place was noisy, but not as noisy because it had a tent roof over a lot of it, and but it also, I talked to much the same people because it didn't promote, but moving around, you had to go get food, but something about the structure, it wasn't easy to change tables, didn't run into people and sit down at another table and so forth. So of course, there are a function. There's a function of both formats, but I don't think there's a lot of virtue in seating you with a bunch of people you don't know, right? You might end up with a wonderful conversation, you might not. And so I think something closer to a cocktail party format, in which there are lots of places to stand and set your plate down, or places to sit, and it's something that promotes shuffling of the personnel is probably better.
Seems like this was a question that came up with the mathematicians, not so much for the computer scientists, but do you see math for them as a social sport? And it sounds like in all of your answers, it's really been yes, it's very much a social activity for you.
Yeah, well, I'm not very good at doing homework, so much of what I accomplish is but that's, so do you find the mathematicians social or not?
Mostly. There was actually, it was one computer scientist who, Sertoni Hoare, I guess he was a Turing Award recipient, yes. I think. He was the only one who really said that he mostly learned from papers as opposed to being social with others.
Okay. So I'm not sure what I learn where or how. I think if I could make one change in my career, in the way I approached it, not in events, I think it would be that if I could have worked on very early on my shyness about what happens. Somebody asked me a question. I know I could answer it, but I can't answer it without a piece of paper and some quiet, and that's just because I'm sort of afraid. I have stage fright. And that's not a lot of people. I mean, I don't have stage, I talk to large audiences just fine. But in interaction, somebody asked me about some theorem yesterday, and I knew that if I worked on it a little while, I could prove it. But I couldn't remember instantly how to prove it. And I have lots of that in interactions. And if I could have gotten over that, then I believe that since I'm basically a social person, I could have got a lot of profit out of something. Hilary Putnam, whom one might count, I suppose, as one of my mentors, is a philosopher and a logician and a mathematician. And he wrote there's a volume in the Encyclopedia of Living Biography, which was published while he was still living, but only a year or so before his death. That volume starts with his, quote, intellectual autobiography. So there's about 100 pages, recounts his life with great emphasis on the work that he did. And in it he says that mathematicians write their papers, basically as a joke that writing a mathematics paper is going back and coming off your tracks so nobody can see how. And he in essence says that. He doesn't say it quite that rudely. But he said, but mathematicians aren't like that when they talk. So he's learned most of the mathematics he knows by talking to mathematicians. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I can't learn very well by talking to people because, as I say, I feel challenged. My mind glazes over when I'm standing talking to people, and I feel I don't have the right answer available or something. It explains something to me, so you understand. I think I'm supposed to understand, but I can't understand yet. And so that's, I say, if I could make see one change in the style of my life that would probably have made it much better, that would be it.
I appreciate you doing the interview because it seems like this might set off that fight or flight.
Oh, no, I think not. Because, you could probably manage to ask a question that would produce that result, but it's more about things that I should know and could figure out, but can't figure out in real time with people depending on me. You often, and I can figure out later in my imagination what I should have said. I remember once somebody was giving a talk about, I never knew whether he knew this or not because I never asked the question because I couldn't formulate what I'm about to say. But he had said he had a register with 31 elements in it, and the talk was about ways of computing sequences. And he said something, you had to pick the taps very carefully or something like that. And I wanted to ask him that, 31, with register of length 31, it doesn't matter. Essentially any set of taps works. Maybe one doesn't work and no taps doesn't work, but every other set of taps works, right? But I couldn't get clear in my mind the argument for that, right? Which is very straightforward. Once I had a little quiet, I realized, well, yes, 2 to the 31 is the size of the field. 2 to the 31 minus 1 is prime because 31 is a Mersenne prime. That means there are a prime number of non-zero elements. So if you start with any element other than 1, it has to generate because its order. It's a subgroup, it has to decide the order of the field. But I was afraid, I couldn't get that clear in my mind there, so I never got to ask him whether he realized that this register of 31 he had didn't have this problem he'd mentioned. So that's probably a very good example of what, how these things work for me.
Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit about 5-year period since this is the 5th HLF.
Okay.
and actually let's start with 5 years ago because that was before you had received the Turing Award. How has your life changed in those 5 years?
Well, okay, so you have to recognize that the biggest influence in my life over the past 5 years has nothing to do with this, has to do with my wife's illness and death. Okay, so in the fall of the last I did any international traveling was summer of 2013. And in the fall of 2013, my wife's cancer spread to her back, and she didn't immediately realize that, and she didn't have a solid diagnosis till February, and she had one of these $1 million all-day surgeries in February, and we didn't think she was going to live 2 months. and she was discovered by an oncologist, a medical oncologist, who thought looked at the characteristics of the case and thought she could treat her, and sure enough, got 2 years of fairly productive life by being treated with estrogen inhibitors. But in any event, the point is I've had solid 4 years in which I could barely travel anywhere, and this last year, in essence, I hadn't. Last year before her death, I didn't go anywhere, but that really, I lost a lot of touch with this world. So how my life has changed in the last 5 years, it became entirely a life of very funny sort of second honeymoon with Mary, because we spent so much of our time together, and we enjoyed a lot of our time together. But of course, also, it was a very sad period, and so it was distinctly, no other 5 years in my life ever has been at all like this, or probably ever will be. And that's the answer to that question.
An unexpected answer, certainly.
Well,
I'm sorry I didn't know that was happening during this whole period.
were you at the award ceremony last year?
No.
Oh, okay. Because Mary was there, but she was hobbling around on a cane. I mean, she looked lovely, but she was, that was the last party she was able to get to. She wasn't well enough to go to any of there were 3, private events held to fet us, and Mary didn't get to any of them.
And by the way, if you want me to remove that section from
No,
the-
I don't.
Okay. The last thing I want to ask you is, since most of these people are 22 to 27 or so.
Is that right? Okay, the one I spent most of the time with yesterday was 33.
Could be.
He
could
actually
be.
teaches at Cambridge
I'm
University.
sort of guessing that they're around that age because you've got a mixture of masters and doctoral and postdoc and that sort of thing.
Okay, I don't know anything about the filtering process that found these 400 or 500 people.
But let's just talk about that, late 20s, let's just say.
Well, mid-20s, yeah, okay.
Mid to late 20s. I guess the first thing is to think back to when you were that age, and then is there anything that you would say to people, to these researchers of that age, that they should be focusing on at that period in their career?
Well, I don't know. I suspect their career is a little different from mine, because I'm a particularly lousy student, okay? And so my career was dominated by the fact that I barely graduated from MIT. I didn't get into graduate school. I needed to dodge the draft. Right. So I got a job for an outfit called MITRE, where I had the incredible good luck. I mean, my life is dominated by good luck, as far as I can see. I had the incredible good luck to get into, be able to work on a project called Math Lab that was sponsored by independent research funds. That was of interest to Minsky. Minsky gave us, let us use his computer at the AI lab. That meant I didn't have to go, I lived 2 blocks from there in Cambridge. I didn't have to go out to MITRE every day. So I continued to live very much like an academic researcher, rather than like a 9-to-5er.
And you didn't have a doctorate at this time?
No. I don't exactly have a real doctorate now. I mean, the Jim Massey at the ETH, I think it's a lovely, nicely tied up story, but Jim Massey at the ETH got hot under the collar when he learned that Stanford hadn't given me a doctorate for the public key work. And it's not for the usual reason. That is, Marty was talking about trying to get me to be, quote, all but courses, because I was there 4 years. I took 4 courses, and I wrote 4 papers, and I've forgotten what the 4 courses were. I've been making a living off the papers ever since. Right. So it happened that electrical engineering, unlike computer science, if we'd been in computer science, I probably would have been all right, because it didn't have much by way of course requirements and might well have been willing to waive what there were. But electrical engineering liked courses, and expected to take a lot of courses. And I take courses, I'm great on the first 3 days, and then I get behind, and then I lose, I stop coming to class and things like that. I'll tell you one thing that bothers me about this interview is that I had failed to put on my wedding ring, which I have never worn all the time because I found it psychologically comfortable, but physically uncomfortable, particularly when I'm typing. So I will add that to my
Well, the
decor.
shot is more or less here.
Okay,
so
then you probably won't see it. You can Photoshop it back into all of the previous
You're asking a lot.
I am. I'm a pretty demanding guy.
What you could do is you could just start using your left hand to gesture.
Have I mostly been using my right? I don't pay any attention. You were asking, what I would tell 25-year-olds about their careers, and I suspect I faced different problems. I can tell you, what I did almost exactly 25. Once again, I had good luck. Simultaneously, we lost the money for the math lab project. That's complicated politics of the rules about how much could be spent on MITRE and things of that kind. And it drifted off to MIT and became the Maxima project. And maybe I could have stayed and worked on that, but I had become interested in proof of correctness of programs. I thought, and still think basically, that that's the most important problem in contemporary engineering. And John Mccarthy was the person who understood that problem at the time. And he came to town and I talked to him. And he had an opening in the fall, and I went to work for him. So that's why I went out to Stanford. And so is that, well, that kind of thing, I suppose, will happen to people. That is, as your project's fundings go away and things like that. But there's something in that. I mean, we old farts all say, because we got away with it, do what interests you, do what you love, work on problems that you can't avoid working on. And I think, in certain circumstances, people say correctly, that's kind of an idealistic thing, but insofar as you can do that, I think you probably should. However, I'm also aware the world has changed a lot, so I don't know how to put that. I'm not sure that's much help to these people in putting that into action.
You're right that that's the number one thing that every laureate has agreed on, work on things that interest you, for what it's worth.
Well, I think it means we got away with it. That's why we got into this position. Somebody else, right? I mean, that's an important point. But I don't know how to make it at all objective.
Is there anything, I know that, again, we're running late. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I don't remember anything, so we have another 2-minute session sometime later after I think of something.
Okay. Well, if you see me running around and you say, you got to record this, then just...
But I think very few people realize the role that luck plays in their success. And I know a number of other people like Ivan Sutherland that agree with me about that. And I think there's this very famous thing that I heard attributed to, I can't think of his first name, a golfer named Jones. But I'm not at all, he's 1920 or something. It's and I was told this by Dick Leibler, who was formerly head of research at NSA, and was a fanatical golfer. And in his 70s, he shot in the low 70s. So in any event, this guy was a reporter, I think, said to him, "Boy, you were pretty lucky." And he said, "Yeah, and it's funny. The harder I practice, the luckier I get." And I think that you can't deny the truth of that, right? And so I think there are a bunch of people around here whose hard work is a lot of their luck. I can never detect, almost very few periods in my life when I feel like I did any piece of hard work because I feel incapable of working on anything that doesn't, that I don't work on because I can't keep myself from working on it. So I spent you never got to asking me what the most important I think you were going to ask me, or did, and I didn't answer what the most important 5 years of my life were. And they're approximately, say, from 1973 to 1978, or 72 to 78, that in August 72, I was rescued from proof of correctness by the accidental discovery of cryptography. And that's described in many interviews, and we haven't got time to run over it now. But in the spring of 73, I left on an indefinite leave of absence and began traveling around the country, digging up rare manuscripts in libraries, looking for people who were willing to talk, and thinking about these problems. And I guess I've always been I like working I work in cafes now. I went around to visit people at colleges, and I worked, sat around the cafeterias and worked. I'd always done that. So then, as I put it, I made my first discovery. I met my wife, and I would not have made any of the other discoveries, I think, without that. Because not only people always talk about how their wives supported them and so forth. That's one very important thing. She had an irrational faith in me, right? And later, she had at times an equally irrational lack of faith in me, right? That's the way time and relationships go. But that's one thing. The other point was everybody loved her, and that just opened up relationships. Right? I think she's utterly critical in my relationship with Marty Hellman. On the first day I met Marty Hellman, we continued talking, for an hour after the appointed time, and he had to go home for dinner. He invited us over to dinner. She called in. She'd been taking the car off and gone somewhere, and told her how to get to Marty's place, so she came by. I don't remember how that worked, but we were there. We talked until 11 at night, and as families, we got along incredibly well. Well, suppose that hadn't been true. Suppose I'd been alone. Suppose I'd been with somebody abrasive like my previous partner. Then, I think all of that might not have happened, and Marty and I might not have worked together for this incredibly productive 4 years.
Well, thank you so much for taking so much time.